Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Gaitán Johannesson at Lighthouse Books, and this is a new video series of author and activist interviews called Read, Think, Act. I am delighted to be here today with Joe Mulhall. Joe is a senior researcher at Hope Not Hate, which is the largest anti-fascist and anti-racist organization in the UK. He's a historian and the author of this book, which is just out this month, Drums in the Distance, Journeys into the Global Far Right. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for joining us. This is really exciting.
No, thanks very much for having me. It's very kind.
I read the book in a way that I haven't read a book for quite a while, which is like in one big gulp, just really intensely over a few days. And I think for your book, it was, well, partly it was quite harrowing, but it was also really useful because it made it easier to, I think, make the connections between different events and between different groups and actors that have come up in the last decade or so that you've been working. And I wanted to start by asking if that at all mirrors the way that you wrote it.
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks for reading it. That's always exciting when someone says they've actually read it. I wrote it really quickly. Yeah. I mean, it tells the story of a decade, right? So the stories and kind of the personal stories go back 10, 11 years, but I wrote it really, really quickly. I had a sabbatical from Hope Not Hate. And I wrote all of the kind of first person bits in maybe 4 months. And then the kind of historical bits and the kind of more academic sections I plugged in afterwards. But the whole book took probably under a year, which I guess, I can't tell. Is that quick? Is that not quick? I don't know really.
I think it is quick. It sounds quick, yeah.
But the big chunk of it was written in a kind of very intense, maybe 2 or 3 months when I kind of did it full time. So maybe that's what I was kind of hoping would give it that energy, that it was kind of written like those kind of first person stories came out in kind of one go really.
I mean, I can imagine that the book is peppered with, considering the subject matter and what you do throughout the book when you go to demonstrations and interact with far-right activists in different ways and infiltrate some of the groups, the book must be peppered with difficult decisions. And you do mention some of this at the very end in the kind of conclusions. And, you know, obviously, without going into detail, what kind of decisions overall were the most difficult to make working with the book?
Yeah, I mean, it was fun actually, like sitting back and reflecting on it. Obviously, like most of the time, like anything, it's rare that you sit down and spend months and months back on all the decisions you've made in the last 10 years. I mean, maybe some people do, but I certainly didn't. And so writing the book was a strange situation where I had to kind of go back and evaluate the decisions I'd made. And well, there was a couple. For the book itself, there was basic decisions like what can I include and what can't I include. So the book tells the stories of various infiltrations I've done. It tells the stories of operations that Hope Not Hate have done undercover with other people that maybe I've put inside, and just working out which stories can I actually tell and which ones would either put people at risk or would actually some of them are still ongoing, or the people involved we can't ever tell anyone. So there's those kind of basic decisions. But there was a few times kind of looking back where it was about judging the decisions I had made. And, you know, some of them were like, I mean, the hardest ones were, there's a number of stories in the book. There's a chapter, for example, about the alt-right, this international far-right movement. And I couldn't go undercover in it. I kind of went undercover here and there at the early stages of it. But then I put someone else undercover, a friend of mine called Patrick Hermanson, who's in the book. And looking back on that, there was decisions there where like he was in America with kind of heavily armed groups in extremely dangerous situations. And I kind of looked back on a few of those decisions and thought, I probably put him in harm's way in a way that I might not have had the right to do, or perhaps I didn't, you know. So there's a few times when I look back and thought, actually, did I do things that the mission as we would have called it was so overwrought and so important and all encompassing that I actually made decisions that put other people at risk, which is obviously different to putting myself at risk, you know.
At the beginning of the book, in the introduction even, I think you talk about how it might seem academic to make all of these exact distinctions between different kinds of far-right thinking and different groups and different thoughts and strands, but actually it's absolutely vital. And whether it be in terms of like actual terms. I mean, and it made me think I'm definitely guilty of using the term fascist probably quite willy-nilly. I think a lot of people do.
We all are.
So, and because it becomes one of those things, and it's another kind of, you know, the bad guy. It's like the enemy, right? And I would just love to ask you a little bit more about that. What do you think is the biggest risk of generalizing, particularly in terms of the far right?
Yeah, I do think it's really important to be accurate, and the main reason is we can't really properly oppose or fight something we don't properly understand. And generalizations are unhelpful if we're working out which tactics are going to be effective, because different tactics are effective against different far-right groups or different areas of the far right. And one of the problems, I think, with the anti-fascist movement, of which, of course, I'm part, is if everyone is a fascist, the tactics you can use to oppose fascism are more extreme than the tactics are legitimate to use against more moderate far-right groupings. And one of the dangers is there is often a thing where we fight the battles of the 20th century, which was fascist versus anti-fascist. And so we shoehorn everything into fascist. And then that means that we know how to oppose them. We do all the things that we did against fascists in the 20th century. And I think that can be unhelpful. Of course, we should use those traditional tactics against fascists where they manifest. But, you know, we're talking about a lot of the stuff I talk about the Rook is like the radical right across Europe. So many of the radical right groupings are not fascist. They're in parliaments as well. They are genuinely democratic, or in some form of democratic. And so there's a different way we need to oppose them. There's not the same way we should oppose a neo-Nazi skinhead. And so it basically boils down to, if we don't accurately define who it is we're opposing and why we're opposing them, then we're going to be less effective at what we can do about them and how we fight back, I think.
But speaking of new thoughts, or rather things that happen in the world that might offer new fuel or like take far right thinking in new directions, I was really keen to talk to you about the connections between the climate crisis and the rise of the far right. And especially with the background in the climate movement. I just wonder what you think are useful ways, and this is a massive question, so feel free to just say what comes to mind first. What are the most urgent ways in which the climate movement and the anti-fascist movement, or activists in both of those strands, can work together?
Yeah, I think it's the big question. And in the last chapter of the book, I talk about Brazil, and I use Brazil kind of to get like with Bolsonaro, but I use that to kind of go into this question a bit more. And it's a huge, huge problem. I think there's a number of things, right? The biggest problem, I think, is often the climate movement and the anti-racist movement and my section, we all speak different languages in some senses, and are struggling to find a common language. And a few years ago, I went to Morocco to kind of meet kind of refugees and migrants that were trying to make their way to Europe through West Africa. And some of them were kind of refugees from climate crises, the drought in West Africa and those sorts of things. And I remember talking to a refugee group in Rabat in Morocco, and them saying climate change is not a problem for us, right? And I thought, this is really strange. Why is it? And their big concern was that if I went back and wrote an article in Europe saying millions of people are going to be on the move in the next 50, 100 years because of the climate crisis, and many of them are going to move north into Europe, that's going to create a backlash from the groups like the far right that are going to say, look, even progressive movements are saying millions of non-white people are going to be flooding into Europe. And yet, of course, the truth is that there is going to be millions of people on the move around the world in the next 100 years because of the climate crisis, and many of them will come to North America and Europe for all sorts of reasons, right? And so how it is we have this even conversation between the various movements, which is, we can't just stick our head in the ground and say this won't happen, right? But also, from the climate sectors, some people in the climate movement are very much saying we need to jump up and down and say this is going to be a vast crisis. We need to, people's homes are going to be destroyed. Millions of people are going to move around the world. And the refugee sector is saying, don't say that. That's going to be terrifying for people in Europe, and that's going to cause a backlash. Everyone knows what the truth of this is, right? The truth is that the climate crisis is here and it's happening. And it's going to destroy millions of homes and make parts of the earth probably uninhabitable. But we have to find a language that allows us to deal with that crisis, that doesn't, for example, create a backlash from the far right, but also doesn't allow us to bury our heads in the sand and just say the best way we deal with this is pretend it's not happening. And I don't have an answer for that, right? But I don't have an answer for that. But the question is actually are all these movements talking enough? You know, and we Hope Not Hate ran a few conferences in New York a few years ago, bringing together some of these different sectors. And by the end of the day, there was very little progress. But at least we got around the table and had the conversation. And I think that's the big question here. And the other thing is things, you know, within like the climate movement, understandably things like, you know, population controls. There can be language again, and you can hear some of that language which echoes a lot of the stuff we would monitor in the far right.
Yeah.
You know? And one of the big things is, I think traditionally we thought the big danger that the far right posed to the climate change movement was climate denial. And that for many years was what the far right engaged in. Now I think looking forward, the big danger is going to be co-option of the climate issue, not denial of it. It's going to be saying, yes, the climate crisis is here. We need to close our borders. We need to keep our resources. We need to stop people coming from the other parts of the world. We need to hoard our water, etc.
When you realize how mainstream the far right has become in certain instances, you know, there's a demonstration in Prague in the Czech Republic where you just realize that actually this is just huge, and there are politicians there, and it's massive and it's accepted. Does that completely change the way that anti-fascist work needs to be done when it is suddenly mainstream?
Yes, it is. I mean, the bit you mentioned there in Prague was terrifying, right? I was stood in a demo next to Tommy Robinson, the kind of famous British far-right anti-Muslim activist. And on stage, Zeman walks on, the president of Prague, right? The president of the Czech Republic, and says exactly the same things that Tommy Robinson would have said, you know, about Islam and Muslims invading and stuff. It does change the way it is, right? Because it's no longer about a battle on the streets necessarily. It's no more, you know, those battles will continue. The battles for our communities will continue. But when these things are in parliamentary chambers, they demand winning just so many more people. It's not just about, say, protecting our community because someone wants to march through it, or you know, looking after our street or our town. This becomes, we have to win so many more people because it becomes a battle at the ballot box. You know, we've seen, you know, Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India. To unseat these people takes millions of votes, you know, tens of millions of votes. Same with Poland and Hungary, etc. And so it involves us actually, I think, much more fundamental, in some senses less glamorous work than you know, the book, it talks about infiltration and research and those things I think are important. But the way we're actually going to win this is by going back into those communities that are voting for these people and actually like knocking on their doors and spending time in those communities and actually dealing with the material needs of those communities that have been ignored and ostracized and you know, deindustrialization, globalization, or you know, all of these things that have contributed to a situation whereby they are looking for an alternative, and that alternative is the far right. Dealing with mainstream far right politics is much longer term. It's about winning those communities. It's about winning back millions of people that feel that they have no option but to look to the far right. It's not just about removing a platform from a fascist. It's about actually winning a whole community or winning a whole country in lots of these cases. So it's a much longer term thing, and sometimes that's going to involve not having a demonstration, not waving a flag, not doing the traditional things that the left does, but actually rooting ourselves back in those communities that, you know, the progressive or social democratic and socialist parties of Europe and need to go back into the communities that often they've been ignoring for too long, and they need to re-win them. They need to offer them hope, really.
For anyone who, for whatever reason, you know, isn't able to do the kind of work that Hope Not Hate and other anti-fascist, anti-racist organizations do on the ground or in terms of campaigning, how would you say that we can best support that kind of work?
Well, I mean, I'd get shouted at if I didn't say donate to Hope Not Hate.
Yeah, well,
no, in all seriousness, though, I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do, right? I mean, one of the things to do is you say, like, get educated around the arguments, because we all have these discussions about these things with our family, with our friends. You know, I was going to say sometimes on the bus, but only if safe, you know. But, you know, there will be times when we will come into contact with individuals that have views, and we should, if we can give ourselves the tools to have those difficult conversations, we can make changes on an individual to people that down our football club or our boxing club or down the pub or in the theatre or wherever it is you hang out. So being knowledgeable about these arguments, etc., and kind of arming yourself with the arguments to be able to have those difficult conversations, we can all do that at a sort of like base level. There's also other things, legislation going through Parliament in Britain right now about refugees and asylum seekers. Write to your MP, read into it. If you think they're unacceptable, send a letter to your MP, write a letter to your local newspaper, donate to your local food bank, donate to your local refugee centre. There's all these kind of like things that if you don't feel comfortable joining an anti-far right demonstration, or you don't feel comfortable doing some of the stuff that's in the book, or, there's all sorts of things we can do at our local level, which can all contribute to more effective change,
And you mentioned earlier the importance of the kind of long haul work of community work, of going back to people's communities and looking at the needs, what's there,
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is that one of the places where, if you look at the British National Party, right, which I talk about in the book, there's all sorts of arguments for why it rose. Some are economic, some are cultural, but there is a reason that it happened in Dagenham, right, that it happened in Stoke, that it happened in Burnley. These were communities that were really struggling, and people that don't often kind of that have an issue with their local community, or they see their local community as deprived, etc. They don't have pride in their local community, can often be angry and disenfranchised and look for alternatives, But that's why little things like, community groups that look after the park on their estate give people pride in their local community. And, when the BNP knock on their door and say, God, this place is a dump, it's because of the immigrants, they turn around and say, well, actually, we've got this beautiful new park. I mean, that's a really simplest, version of what I'm talking about on a grand scale. But, working in our local communities. And the other thing is like getting to know our neighbours. I know that sounds really trite, but like one of the great things about the pandemic is people talking to their neighbours. One of the things the BNP used to do was knock on doors and say, I tell you why you've not got a job with or a house, or your, the hospitals or schools, is because all these people have arrived in your community and they've taken them from you, right? Now, understandably, lots of people believe that, right? But you believe it less if you know them.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, if people know each other, the ignorance breeds from ignorance. It's like you often find that the big areas where the far right is successful are homogenous white communities next door to multicultural areas. Because when you live in an actual multicultural area, you interact with people from all different backgrounds. It's harder to believe the lies that the far right peddle. So I think that's one of the keys as well. Is more close-knit communities are harder for the far right to prey upon.
Absolutely. I'm going to go back full circle to books and reading, and I'm sorry if I put you on the spot a wee bit here. Maybe I should have prepared you. What's the latest book, or a fairly recent book you've read, that made you want to go out and take action in some way?
Well, it's funny actually. I just had COVID last week, so I was locked in my flat.
Oh wow!
And, I had a whole 10 days to do reading because I had nothing else to do, and I started my next book, right? And it's about looking at music and how music can be used to resist and fight back against prejudice and discrimination and oppression. And so I read 3 or 4 biographies of Fela Kuti, the Nigerian jazz musician. So that was really inspiring. And so now I'm kind of like, I'm looking into that in depth now. So I've got about a whole pile on the floor just here of books about Fela Kuti or by various people in his orbit. So that was the last thing I read in terms of nonfiction anyway.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Joe. This has been an absolute delight. And so interesting.
Thanks for having me.
So inspiring. Thank you. And yeah, people should go and check out this book.